the chalk line snapped sharply across the raw cedar, sending a faint cloud of blue dust drifting into the warm afternoon air. I kept my thumb pressed against the board, feeling the grain beneath my skin. It was solid. Straight. Reliable. I appreciated materials that behaved the way they were supposed to. What didn't behave the way it should was the bright neon orange sticker stuck to the front door of the house next door. I brushed sawdust off my gray t-shirt and set the block plane back on the workbench. From my driveway, I had a clear view of Avery's place. Her home was an older craftsman, something you rarely saw in this neighborhood. It had character, but it was clearly showing its age. The front porch sagged just a little in the middle, and the wooden fence between our yards leaned a few degrees off plumb. The orange sticker was an HOA violation notice. A loud metallic thud echoed from Avery's backyard. I walked down my driveway, stepping over a coiled air hose, until I reached the property line. The fence between us had weathered into a dull gray. The wood felt rough under my arms as I leaned against the top rail. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the grass. Avery was struggling with a dented metal trash can, its sides rusted and uneven. Her jaw was tight with effort. She wore a white short-sleeved button-down shirt, the collar slightly crooked, the fabric glowing in the soft golden light of evening. She looked worn out. Not the kind of tired you feel after losing an hour of sleep. The deeper kind. The kind that settles into your bones. When she noticed me, she let the trash can go and walked toward the fence. She rested her elbows on the top rail across from me and leaned forward, her chin close to her hands. A faint, guarded smile appeared on her lips, though it didn't match the tension around her eyes. "I saw you bring a girl home last night," she said. Her voice sounded steady, like she was aiming for casual conversation to hide whatever was really weighing on her. I stayed still for a moment, letting the silence sit between us. The wood pressed lightly into my forearms. I looked straight at her, keeping my face neutral before letting one corner of my mouth lift slightly. "Are you jealous?" I asked. She released a quiet breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Interesting," she said. "You usually only bring lumber into that driveway. I was starting to think you were building a wooden bride in that garage." "My younger sister, Maya," I said calmly. "Her apartment flooded. She's staying in my guest room until the drywall gets replaced." "Oh." Avery looked down at the fence, picking at a dry splinter in the wood with her fingers. The playful tone disappeared, and the tiredness came back into her face. "Well, it's good you've got the space. What's the orange sticker, Avery?" I didn't soften the question. I just said it plainly. Her shoulders dropped. She stopped messing with the splinter. "Mrs. Higgins from the HOA did a drive-by inspection," she said. "They're saying the front porch is a safety hazard. And the fence doesn't match the neighborhood aesthetic rules anymore." She nodded toward the crooked boards between us. "I have 14 days to fix everything or they start charging me $200 a day." 14 days isn't even enough time to get lumber delivered," I said. "I know." Her eyes shifted to the rusty trash can before returning to me. "And I can't afford to hire a contractor anyway. I guess I'll have to figure out how to brace the porch myself." "You're a designer," I said evenly. "You draw plans. You don't build load frames." "I'll learn." She lifted her chin slightly. It was clear she wasn't asking for help. It was a boundary. "You don't have the tools," I replied. "I'll rent them." I looked past her at the porch roof. The wooden columns were rotting at the base from water damage. One strong storm and the overhang could rip the ledger board right off the house. Then I looked back at Avery. Her hands were gripping the fence so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. "I'll do the labor," I said. "You pay for the materials." She frowned and stepped back half a step. "Gabriel, no. You run a custom furniture business. Your hourly rate is probably worth more than my car. I can't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask," I said. "I offered." I tapped my knuckles lightly against the top rail of the fence. "And I'm not doing it for free. You'll design the plans for my workshop expansion. Trade for trade. Equal value. It wasn't actually equal. We both knew that. But the structure of the deal mattered. It gave her something solid to stand on. She studied my face carefully, searching for sympathy or pity. I made sure she didn't find either. I only gave her a calm, measured look. Trade for trade, she repeated slowly. The tightness in her jaw eased just a little. Okay, she said. When do we start? Tomorrow at 6 o'clock, I replied. I'll pull the permits. I pushed myself off the fence and headed back toward my shop. I didn't turn around, but I listened. Behind me, I heard her release a long, shaky breath. The sound of that breath settling into quiet relief felt heavier than any piece of lumber I'd carried all week. At 5:45 the next morning, the air was cool and smelled like dew and damp pavement. I walked across the wet grass toward her front porch carrying a DeWalt transit level and a pry bar. Avery was already outside. She held a mug of coffee and wore a thick canvas jacket over her clothes. You're early, she said. I like measuring when everything's quiet. I set up the transit level on its tripod. Hold this. I handed her the loose end of the tape measure. She took it without speaking and walked to the far corner of the porch. For the next hour we worked in silence. I called out measurements, and she wrote them down on a clipboard. I didn't try to make small talk. The work itself was the conversation. I examined the ledger board attached to the house. The lag bolts were rusted completely through. This is worse than it looks, I said, shining a flashlight into the gap between the wood and the brick wall. The water barrier failed. The rot goes all the way into the rim joist. Avery closed her eyes briefly. How bad? Bad enough that Higgins isn't wrong about the safety hazard, I said. But I can sister a new joist to the existing frame and flash it correctly. I kept the explanation simple. It'll hold. She stared at the rotting wood for a moment, then looked back at me. Can we really finish this in 14 days? We'll finish it in 10. Over the next 4 days, my driveway slowly turned into a construction zone. I set up my miter saw, laid out the sawhorses, and stacked fresh lumber along the edge of the concrete. The steady rhythm of the work created a routine that kept Avery and me close without either of us saying much. Every time the saw stopped, she was nearby. She never hovered or got in the way, but she always found something useful to do. She hauled away scraps of wood, held boards steady when I needed an extra set of hands, and swept piles of sawdust off the driveway. More than once, I caught myself watching her when I should have been checking my angles. I noticed the small things. The way she tied her hair back using a piece of scrap wire she found in my toolbox. The way she quietly sorted my screws by length and set them into neat little rows without me asking. I kept a careful distance. If I handed her a tool, I made sure our fingers didn't touch. I kept the conversation short and focused on the work. By the 5th afternoon, the sky had turned a deep purple, the kind of color that meant a serious summer storm was on the way. I was at the saw cutting the last decorative corbels for the porch posts. The rain was coming fast, and I needed to finish before it hit. I was focused completely on the spinning blade when a sleek silver sedan pulled up to the curb. It parked illegally right in front of the fire hydrant. Mrs. Higgins stepped out, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. She marched straight up Avery's walkway, carefully stepping around the stack of fresh lumber. Miss Bell. Her voice was sharp enough to slice through the quiet. I shut off the saw. The sudden silence across the yard felt heavy. Avery wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped down from the unfinished porch. Mrs. Higgins, we're still well inside the 14-day window. The board has received several complaints about the noise, Higgins said, her eyes moving across the tools scattered across the driveway and the exposed framing of the porch. And this appears to be a major structural alteration. Did you submit the architectural review paperwork? It's a repair, not an alteration, Avery replied, her voice tight. We're replacing rotted wood with identical materials. That still requires a permit and board approval, Higgins said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. I'm issuing a stop work order until the board can review the project next month. If you continue working, you will be fined. Avery froze. A stop work order meant leaving the porch open and unfinished right before a storm. It meant the rain would pour straight into the structure and spread the damage into the house itself. I saw her hand fall to her side, her fingers curling slowly into a fist. I set my speed square down and walked over. I stepped between Higgins and Avery. I didn't crowd the HOA president, but my height and stillness shifted the balance of the space. "Mrs. Higgins," I said calmly. My voice stayed low and steady. Section 4, Paragraph B of the Municipal Building Code. Higgins blinked and took a small step back. "Excuse me?" Emergency stabilization of a failing load-bearing structure does not require pre-approved architectural review if the failure creates immediate risk to the primary dwelling. I pointed toward the exposed framing. The ledger board failed. If that storm hits tonight and this porch isn't secured, the roof load could rip the brick fascia right off the house. That qualifies as emergency stabilization. Higgins stared at the exposed wood. She probably had no idea what a ledger board was, but she recognized confidence when she heard it. "I'm a licensed contractor," I continued, pulling my state license card from my wallet and holding it out. "The permit number was filed with the city on Tuesday. If you issue a stop work order on an emergency stabilization and the house suffers structural damage, the HOA board becomes responsible for the repair costs." Higgins glanced at the card, then looked up at the sky. A distant rumble of thunder rolled through the neighborhood. She didn't take the card. 14 days, Mr. Simmons, she snapped before turning on her heel. If the project is not aesthetically complete by the deadline, the fines begin. She walked back to her car, climbed inside, and drove off. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before. I turned toward Avery. She was still staring at the empty space where Higgins's car had been. Her shoulders trembled slightly. "Hey," I said quietly. She finally looked at me. "Liability," she said. "You just threatened the HOA board with a lawsuit you can't actually back up." "I can back it up," I replied. "The code citation is real." I picked up my speed square again. "We need to get the flashing sealed before the rain starts." But Avery didn't move. Instead, she sat down on the bottom step of the unfinished porch and pulled her knees up toward her chest. "She's not going to stop," she said quietly. "Even if we finish the porch, she'll find something else. The grass will be too long. The paint won't be the right shade of white." I walked closer and stopped near the steps. I didn't sit down beside her. I stayed standing, giving her space but making sure she knew I wasn't leaving. "Why does this house matter so much?" I asked. It was a direct question. No soft edges. Avery rested her forehead against her knees. "My grandfather built the cabinets in the kitchen," she said softly. "My dad planted the oak tree in the backyard." She took a slow breath. "When everything else fell apart, when my company downsized, when my ex left, this house was the only thing that stayed. It's the only anchor I have." She lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes were bright, but she refused to let the tears fall. "If they find me, I lose it. I can't afford the property taxes and the penalties." I looked back at the house. The brickwork had small imperfections. The roofline dipped slightly in the middle. It wasn't perfect. But it was hers. "You're not going to lose it," I said. "You can't promise that, Gabriel." "I don't make promises," I replied. "I build." I nodded toward the tools. "Grab the flashing tape. We've got work to do." The storm hit an hour later. Rain slammed down in a heavy sheet, turning the yard into thick mud. We kept working. I secured the heavy timber posts while Avery held the level, rain soaking through both of our clothes. We barely spoke. The pounding of rain on the roof drowned out everything else. Finally, I tightened the last bolt. I stepped back under the shelter of the newly secured porch roof. Avery stood beside me, shivering slightly. Wet strands of hair clung to the back of her neck. I looked at her. Rainwater ran down the collar of her jacket. My hand tightened once at my side. Then I slid both hands into my pockets and stayed exactly where I was. "It's solid," I said, my voice rougher than I meant. She stepped forward, placing her hand flat on the massive cedar post I had just set in place. "It is," she said, tilting her head to look at me. "Thank you for not letting her stop the work." "I don't do well with bullies wielding clipboards," I replied. For the first time in days, she smiled, fully, without guard. Her eyes lit up. The rain pounded on the new roof overhead, but the tension in my jaw finally loosened. I exhaled and felt the weight in my shoulders ease. The next morning, the sun was merciless, baking the mud into cracked earth. I was in my driveway, sanding the last trim pieces for the porch, when my sister Maya came outside, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You're working way too hard for a trade deal," she said, setting a mug on my workbench. She leaned against the doorframe, glancing at Avery's house. "She's nice." "She's just a neighbor," I said, keeping the sander moving. "And you rebuild load-bearing structures for neighbors all the time," Maya said, taking a sip. Her voice dropped. "Higgins was asking around about you yesterday, talking to Mr. Wallace down the street, checking if your commercial workshop variance is still valid." I paused. The sander buzzed in my hands. "My variance is bulletproof," I said. "Doesn't mean she can't tie up your shop with complaints. If she does, you can't fill orders. You lose money, Gabe." I wiped sawdust from the trim board. "I'll handle Higgins." Maya shook her head gently. "Just don't burn yourself out trying to keep her house intact." She didn't argue further and went back inside. Across the property line, Avery was painting the new porch railings white, careful and deliberate. I saw her stretch her back, the stress visible in the way her shoulders tightened. I wasn't letting Higgins take that house. 2 days before the HOA deadline, the trap snapped. I was at the hardware store when my phone buzzed. "Avery." "Gabriel, you need to come back." Her voice was flat, drained. I dropped the box of screws I'd been holding, walked outside, and drove back to the neighborhood. Avery stood in her driveway holding a thick manila envelope. The porch was finished, painted and perfect. The yard spotless. But the look on her face told me it wasn't about aesthetics. "What is it?" I asked. She handed me the envelope. They moved the goalposts. Inside were formal HOA documents, not about the porch. The problem was the property line. "They ordered a new survey last month," she said hollowly. "The fence dividing our yards, it sits 2 feet onto my property. Built by the previous owner. It's a non-conforming structure. Because it's on my deeded land, I'm responsible. They're demanding I tear it down and replace it with wrought iron to match the neighborhood, or face a $500 fine immediately, plus daily penalties." I studied the survey. The fence was old, probably 40 years. "Raw iron for 100 linear feet, $10,000, she whispered. "I don't have it. I can't borrow it. I'm done." "Gabriel, they won." "No, they didn't," I said. I folded the papers and handed them back. "I'll tear the fence down tomorrow." She shook her head, stepping back. "And then what?" "An open yard is another violation. You can't fix this with a hammer. It's paperwork. Money." Her arms crossed, pulling them tight. She stared past me toward my shop. "You need to walk away. Keep fighting Higgins, and she'll go after your shop permits," she said quietly. Maya's words. Always talking too much. But she was right. Avery swallowed hard. "I'm not your responsibility. You rebuilt the porch. You paid your trade debt. You don't owe me anything else. Stop trying to shield me." I didn't argue. Didn't say anything motivational. I simply looked at her, steady and unmoving. "I'll be here tomorrow at 6 o'clock to tear down the fence," I said. Then I turned and walked back to my shop. For the next 4 hours, I didn't touch wood. I sat at my desk with the municipal zoning code, HOA bylaws, and a pot of black coffee. I read every clause, every footnote. I didn't need a hammer. I needed leverage. By 2 a.m., I found it. The following evening, the HOA board held their monthly meeting in the community clubhouse at the subdivision entrance. The air conditioning was aggressive and the room smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. About 20 residents sat in folding chairs. Mrs. Higgins sat at the front behind a folding table, flanked by 2 silent board members. I stood against the back wall, leaning casually. Clean button-down shirt, work boots swapped for dark shoes. Avery arrived 5 minutes late. She looked pale but resolute, holding the manila envelope tightly. When she saw me in the back, her steps faltered for just a second before she squared her shoulders and moved to an empty chair in the second row. She didn't sit. Higgins banged a small wooden gavel. Next item, property line violation at 442 Elm Street. Miss Bell. Avery straightened. She didn't look back. Mrs. Higgins, the survey you submitted is correct, the fence is on my property, I said. But giving someone 3 days to replace a 40-year-old structure with $10,000 of wrought iron? That's unreasonable. The rules are rules, Miss Bell, Higgins replied smoothly, adjusting her glasses. The board voted on the aesthetic guidelines unanimously. If you can't maintain your property to neighborhood standards, perhaps selling is the wiser choice. I know several buyers who are looking for lots. There it was. She wanted the house cleared out, sold, emptied. Avery gripped the envelope but held her ground, refusing to show fear. I pushed off the wall and walked down the center aisle. The room fell silent as I stopped next to her chair. I didn't glance at her, my focus entirely on the table at the front. Mrs. Higgins, I said. My voice carried calmly to the back of the room, steady and firm. Mr. Simmons, you do not have the floor, Higgins snapped. I'm yielding my time to him, Avery said immediately, voice clear and unwavering. I pulled a single sheet from my pocket and laid it on the folding table in front of Higgins. I reviewed the survey you commissioned, I said. It's accurate. It confirms the fence at 442 Elm sits 2 feet onto Miss Bell's property. But it also confirms something else, the community clubhouse we're standing in was built 4 feet over an active municipal utility easement. The room went completely silent. The 2 silent board members straightened in their chairs. That's absurd, Higgins said, her face flushing. It's public record, I corrected. Section 12 of the Municipal Code states that any permanent structure over an active utility easement must be demolished at the owner's expense if it blocks access. In this case, the owner is the HOA. I placed a second sheet on the table, a completed code violation report ready for the city inspector. I hadn't filed it yet. Higgins stared at the document. One board member reached for the survey map, the other stopped pretending to ignore it. What do you want, Simmons? Higgins asked, voice low. A grandfather clause, I said, calm, measured. Miss Bell's fence is a legacy structure. You will issue a formal waiver, exempting 442 Elm from the new aesthetic rules as long as the structures remain safe. You will also cease all targeted inspections of my commercial workshop. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply presented the terms. Higgins looked at the map, then at the code report. She glanced at the 20 residents watching her, realizing she had no leverage left. She pulled a pen, grabbed official HOA letterhead, and began writing. Signed, stamped, and shoved it across the table. I picked it up, verified the wording, and handed it to Avery. Meeting adjourned, Higgins said, standing and leaving the room. The residents began murmuring and packing up. I turned to Avery. She stared at the waiver in her hands, her breath shallow. Let's go home, I said quietly. We walked back to our street in the dark. The summer air was warm and still, the neighborhood quiet except for the hum of streetlights. We stopped on the sidewalk between our driveways. The light from the lamp above cast a warm glow across her face. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "You risked a war with the board for me." "There's no war," I said. "It's just paperwork." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small object, a piece of the old, weathered fence she had been worried about. I had sanded it smooth, oiled it, and carved the house number 442 into it. "The fence stays," I said. "It just needed a repair." She took it. Our fingers brushed for a brief moment, grounding us. She looked at the carved number, then back at me. "You fix things," she whispered. "Even the ones I tell you not to." "I only fix what's structurally sound," I said. She stepped closer deliberately, resting her free hand flat against my chest, over my heart. I placed my hand on hers, pressing gently. I didn't pull her in, I let her choose the distance. Her thumb shifted once on my shirt. She tilted her face up. Eyes locked. Waiting. I leaned down and kissed her. Steady, grounded, certain, like locking a load-bearing beam in place. When I pulled back, I rested my forehead against hers for a long moment, breathing in the night air and the faint scent of cedar. The porch, the fence, the house number in her hand, they were all safe. And I knew exactly where I wanted to be when the next storm came. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood was quiet. The neon sticker was gone. We set up my heavy workbench in the driveway for a small barbecue. Mr. Wallace sat in a lawn chair talking to Maya. Smoke drifted from the grill up into the oak tree. Avery stood laughing at something he said, relaxed, hair loose, tension gone from her shoulders. I stayed by the grill, watching. She caught my eye and walked over, leaning her shoulder against mine, a simple public gesture needing no explanation. I rested my hand on her back, feeling the steady warmth of her presence. The foundation was set. The work was done. The strongest people aren't the loudest, they're the ones who show up, stay steady, and solve the problem that matters most. A real green flag is someone whose care is structured, patient, and consistent. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.